It's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you our plenary speaker for today, day 2, who is Eva Marie Shivers. And I was so glad when I heard that she'd accepted the invitation, because Eva has been a colleague of mine for many years. I will first read off sort of the professional piece about Eva and then talk a little bit more about Eva personally. So Eva Marie Shivers is both an attorney and has her Ph.D. in developmental psychology. And she's the executive director and founder of the Indigo Cultural Center, which is a nonprofit action research firm located in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Shivers' work at Indigo Cultural Center focuses on the developmental niche of early childhood development and education and explores the evolution of frameworks for understanding families' culturally adaptive responses to poverty, systemic racism, and historical marginalization. She has served as Principal Investigator on many child care studies that involve collaborating with community agencies, state departments, and national organizations. And as I mentioned, I've known Eva now for many years, dating back to the time when we were both working on improving the quality of child care, and particularly focused on family, friend, and neighbor caregiving. And when I first met Eva doing that work, I realized what a strong researcher and what a passionate advocate she is for quality of child care, particularly child care that's culturally responsive and that promotes equity. And as we were talking on the drive up about sort of the evolution of our careers and our work, I really appreciated so much how Eva's work has come to incorporate these principles, and how she's just a leader in helping people to think through how equity is so important and how we can improve the opportunities for young children and families, and also her dedication to working with community-based organizations. So anyway, I'm really proud and happy that we have Eva with us today, and I just want to say welcome, and let's have a great session.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I might stand over to the side here. Good morning. I am so happy to be here with all of you on this beautiful campus and seeing all of your beautiful faces. And today we are going to talk about something that tends to be a little bit lower in vibration, but we're going to find the higher vibrations in it today. And I do think that it's important to hold both, just as Deb was really encouraging us to do with the current situation with families being separated. There is a place for righteous anger, and then there's also a place for common humanity, and a place where we're all coming from, a place of love. And those are the kinds of issues that we're going to talk about today. So I'll be sharing a little bit of research that focuses on certain strategies that we're using in Arizona and in early education settings that can help address certain disparities. I'll share with you a little bit about my own journey, and I'll encourage you to go deeper in your work as well. And so, I think more and more of us are realizing that in order to really create systems and provide opportunities for children where they are truly moving forward and progressing, we have to start addressing this thing called the achievement gap or the opportunity gap. And slowly but surely, we as a country, our systems are coming to face the fact that we cannot address these gaps, these opportunity gaps and these achievement gaps without talking about race, without talking about systems, without talking about power, without talking about privilege. It is not always fun to talk about these things and to kind of bear witness to what has happened in our country and where we are now. But what I see in my work, I've been doing this racial equity work, this facilitation and training and consulting with organizations. I've been doing this equity work now for about 10 years. And what I've seen probably just in the last couple of years are more and more people are eager and willing to enter into this conversation about race. They might say, well, I don't really know the words to say, or I'm afraid I might say the wrong thing. I'm afraid I might offend somebody, but I really want to enter into this conversation. And so from that place is where a lot of our work has begun. A lot of the systems building work, a lot of the collective impact initiatives we're seeing is really based on this idea that we all come together for change, but that the change starts with each of us as individuals and also in relationships. So let's start with ourselves. Let's situate ourselves in this conversation. And I'm going to ask you today to constantly come back to yourself, to constantly come back to center, to constantly assess what is it that I believe. And even if you don't have the conscious knowledge of what it is you believe, sometimes you feel it in your body somewhere. So I'm going to encourage you to pay attention to your body, and not just this morning during my talk, but throughout the rest of your time with each other today. So interesting with equity work. I know that a lot of times it's referred to as training, but I don't like to call it training because I feel like when we call things training, it kind of implies this, I heard somebody use this term called an intellectual dump. I don't remember who said it, but it kind of implies that we are just kind of these bodies that happen to be supporting our head, and that's where all the activity is going. It's like these floating heads absorbing all of this information. But what I have found to be true and what I've noticed is that so much of this work around healing and race and equity, some of it is up here, but a lot of it is here. And a lot of it is just in our body and the way that we communicate with each other, even non-verbally. So I'm going to continue to ask you today to come back to yourself and to really kind of assess, is this what I believe too? And I want to let you know just right now that it is perfectly okay that you don't agree with everything that I say. What I'm bringing to you comes from me. It comes from my experiences, starting from my childhood, even before my childhood. It started with who my parents are and who their parents were, right? I bring all of that to you here today, just as you bring all of your experiences here with you in this room, right at this moment, listening to what I'm saying. I actually think it's more exciting if you don't agree with certain things that I say, or if you feel a little bit of triggering or something in your belly or a tightness in your throat. Those are the places to pay attention. And those are the places to really kind of unpack and discover, maybe even a little bit later on your drive home or as you're kind of walking by yourself. Those are the places where we meet our growing edge. Those are the places where the subconscious beliefs sometimes start to surface. So I'm going to encourage you to pay attention to those things. So very quickly, I'd like to outline for you my general approach to doing this equity work. And there are three kind of basic levels, and I didn't start off with this nice, very neat framework. I kind of started all over the place. In fact, I didn't even really see myself as a person who does equity work for quite some time. I was a researcher, as Amy was saying. I'm a researcher who happened to talk about race and to explore issues and examine dynamics that have a lot to do with culture and community, and race was part of that. In fact, I didn't even like to say the word race. I was afraid to say it because of what it might bring up for people and making people feel uncomfortable. So I used words like culture and diversity. I used words like inclusivity, cultural responsiveness, a little bit of cultural competence, but now I don't use that term quite so much. But I stayed away from the word race because of what it brings up. And then about, maybe 7 years ago, I attended a 12-day seminar, and it was for community arts activists. So in my other life, I'm a dancer and a community artist and very interested in that kind of work. So I attended the seminar, and I saw on the agenda ahead of time that the first 3 days we were going to spend in something called an Undoing Racism workshop. Now, I don't know if anybody has ever had that kind of experience before. I had never had it before, but I saw it on the agenda, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, but I probably won't learn a whole lot. It's something that I already do. I'm a researcher, and I read about it and write about it all the time. And boy, was I mistaken. That experience, those first 3 days in that Undoing Racism workshop, completely just simultaneously floored me, but then also completely opened me up. It was a life-changing experience, those 3 days. And during that time, by the end of it, I committed myself to talking more explicitly and more directly about race, and not being afraid to step into a space or even hold space for others to do the same. And I didn't know how it was going to go. I didn't have any training on how to facilitate these conversations. When I first started doing it, my voice was shaky, my stomach was in knots. And then I found the more that I did it, the easier it got. I found a mentor. I started reading more. I started hanging out with other people who were doing this work, and slowly but surely started to really incorporate it into what I do almost on a daily basis. So over the years, there are a couple of lessons that I've learned, some the hard way by things falling apart and then we have to repair, but mostly the lessons I've learned are as a result of really beautiful healing happening, beautiful conversations happening, and really kind of at the individual level, interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. So in regards to the individual level, I'm going to share with you some core tenets about what I believe. And so I think it's really important that in this work, we always act from the center. That means from a place of mindfulness. For those of you who are really interested in ideas of embodied healing, those are strategies also that I'm just kind of beginning to explore in my equity work. And then, there's this quote that I say all the time, and I'll tell you a little bit more about who said it later. But I believe that there can be no collective change without inner change, right? I mean, so many of us want things to be fixed. We don't want things to be broken. We want these trends and these patterns in our country to change. How does that happen? We want other people to kind of do it and then tell us what. I truly believe that this collective change that we all are longing to see, that we're all working for every day, it starts with inner change. And it's not linear. It's always happening simultaneously, all together, all the time. And then in regards to intergroup work, and you guys get this completely because of what it is that you do, I believe in relationship-based racial healing, which means that the best healing, the best conversations can take place within the context of relationships that we have or relationships that we form for that purpose. There is something called narrative healing that people in the equity world are finding to be very effective with equity work. And I think a lot of what we do, especially for those of us who come from infant mental health, is we listen to stories. There are a lot of narratives that we hear. And so this is also really important with equity work. Like I mentioned, building a community on purpose even, where really the goal is to explicitly and intentionally come together to talk about issues related to power and race and privilege and oppression, and to really open that up and to kind of have some ground rules or some group norms and someone to facilitate. And then at the end of the day, we just need to practice with one another. It's so hard for us sometimes to say the words, but the more you hear your own voice saying words like race, racism, racialized, oppression, power, privilege, the more you hear your own voice say it, it becomes less scary. And so people talk about this as a form of literacy. They call it racial literacy. We just need to practice with one another. Many of us agree with a lot of these concepts already in our brain and in our heart. We're just not practiced at talking about it with one another. And then at the institutional level, what I've learned is that it is so important for us to continue building our own knowledge, our concrete knowledge about the history of race in this country and the history of race in other countries, but particularly in this country, if this is where we live and work. And, there are things that happened in our history. Some of those things were undone. Many of those things were not undone. And by revisiting our history and continuing to learn, and by reading people's biographies, reading autobiographies, watching documentaries, and always kind of going deeper with our knowledge, it starts to really inform and shape how we see what's happening in the present day. So in a lot of the sessions that I do with people, we do spend quite a bit of time unpacking different historical events or different trends or policies and how they came to be. And then something else that's really important, and that not a lot of us get in our training in school or even in our trainings or events like this is the ability to really have good systems thinking skills and aptitude with kind of thinking with a systems lens. And in regards to equity, we ask the question, okay, so in our system, right, in early education, in early intervention, in early childhood mental health, whatever that system is, or those systems, because a lot of times we're cross-system, what does equity look like in our system? What are the leverage points? What does this look like in real time, in our real world? I do a lot of work in consultation with state administrators, and they say, okay, we get it, we're on board. Yeah, okay, we want to do this equity work. Okay, great. Where do we start? What does it look like? Can you show me examples of states that are doing something? With the QRIS, like what are they doing with it? As people want to kind of have more concrete ways of understanding how to do this in a system. So in a lot of my work, this is what we do. We make kind of systemic dynamics. We make it more real and concrete. So now I believe in transparency also, and I already shared with you that what I bring in the room with me today is a culmination of my experiences and my beliefs and what I've learned. And so I'm going to share with you my working assumptions. I'm going to be very transparent so you know where I'm coming from. I'm not going to share all my assumptions if we don't have enough time this morning to do that. I'm going to share with you some. And as I share them, I'd like for you to check in with yourself and to ask yourself, do I share this as well? Or, I'm not so sure about that one. You might feel it somewhere in your body when you read it, and that's good. Okay? Because at the end of the day, all of us have working assumptions that we carry with us. If I ask you to put together a slide like this with maybe 5 or 6 assumptions, what would you put on your slides? Right? So here are some of mine. So, race is a socially derived construct that plays itself out in our institutions, communities, and relationships. So race is a socially derived construct. It is an idea that was developed in order to privilege some and to keep out others. It is a construct that played a big role in this country's early history around resources, around land. We had a lot of policies about it. So this is a socially derived construct, not to mean that it's not real, right? Because we feel the reality of what race has done in this country. Some of us feel it every day. But that first and foremost, I'm telling you right now that where I'm coming from, race is something that was derived in our country hundreds of years ago for very specific purposes, mostly having to do with power and economics. It's always power and economics in the middle, right? Things are always kind of controlled in that way. I believe that life in the United States is not fair for everyone. I believe that education, and yes, even early education, is not neutral. Race is inextricably linked with gender, social class, culture, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, right? We can name all other kinds of categories, and it is almost impossible to truly examine race in isolation to these other constructs. I do it artificially, mostly to make a point, but that is not the reality. Life in this country lived as a black man, let's say, who is gay, right? That experience is very different than life lived in this country, let's say, by a white woman who is straight. Very different realities, and almost impossible just to talk about race in isolation without thinking about how those other constructs play out in our lives and in our identities. I believe that not addressing race with children and with one another, that it actually perpetuates the status quo and inequity. So I believe my assumption is, oh yeah, we've got to talk about this. We have to find ways. And yes, we can do this with young children also, because another belief that I have is that young children are not colorblind. They see differences and they see color. They might not ascribe the same meaning to it that we do, but they notice and they're curious about it. And in the absence of us saying things about it, they're left to make up their own minds about race. And the way that children develop is they read their environment, they read what's happening around them, and they come to conclusions. right? And so with us not talking about it, with being silent, right, we leave children to make up their own minds based on what they see in the media, images, interactions. So here's a vision that I've kind of adopted. This is from the Build Initiative. I do a lot of work with them. This is the world that I'm hoping comes about at some point, that race and place, right, like zip code or geographic location, would no longer be predictive of outcomes like health, mental health, development, school readiness, success. That those two constructs would no longer predict who we see at the bottom of all those lists. So why are we gathered here today in this room with me? We talk about change, and so many of us do want change to happen. A lot of times we want other people to kind of play a role in making that change happen, but it's important that we hold one another accountable. In my work, the way that it's evolved is that I started to get called in to do trainings and workshops and sometimes 2-day-long facilitation sessions and, kind of consultation here and there. And many times I was often the only person of color in the room. And a lot of the colleagues I work with, a lot of the groups I'm with are predominantly white. And while I believe in harmony and us all being together and kind of hearing each other's voices, I was eager to not be the one leading the conversations all the time. And so I started working with organizations to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to work so that I'm out of so I no longer have a gig with you. You don't need to hire me to come in anymore. And we started developing this approach where we wanted to develop the capacity within organizations and within a group for them to be able to feel confident to lead conversations about equity themselves, right? So it's this idea, and then they do, and hopefully it continues to grow. Hopefully it's not just 1 or 2 people, but it continues to grow. And this idea is that we hold each other accountable, right? We're friends, we're colleagues, but this issue cannot just rest with the marginalized people in the room or the angry brown woman in the room. It just can't rest that way. Because being that person, always that person to hold that space and to move that work forward, it's not very sustainable. It's not sustainable. What if I moved? Or what if I stopped doing this work? Or what if the one person who's like heading the diversity committee at your group leaves? What we know is that usually that work fizzles out and dies when that person leaves. It's not sustainable, right? It's also not really good for somebody's well-being because it carries a lot of stress being the only one holding this space all the time. And you really have to be careful to kind of protect yourself and take care of your well-being because it's not an easy place to be in. There's anger, there's fear, there's stress, all kinds of things that come along with it, right? As we move this work forward and as we think about our organizations, who are our allies? And can we start to move to a place where we agree to have conversations with one another, right? So that's part of the question. There's a lot of tension between the heartfelt work and then kind of our professional, intellectualized selves, right? But ultimately, where I'm coming from is really probably more of a heart space. There's some intellectualization of this, but really more of a heart space. I believe that we are all in this together. Whether or not we're able or willing or confident enough to start talking about it, we are ultimately all in this together. The things that I seek in doing this work is harmony in our voices. And I don't mean a single note. I don't mean the same note. I don't mean that we all have to see things the same way. That is not what I mean by harmony. I mean harmony, the beauty that comes from lots of different notes and lots of different strains and different melodies. It's the beauty that comes when we share our stories and our experiences and our very real truths with one another. I'm talking about that kind of harmony where we can truly listen to one another. Because with that comes healing and ultimately hope. So something that I like to do in I think with this type of a presentation, it might not be the best situation to do some community building, and you guys have already been together for the past 2 days, but generally I do believe that it's very important to do some grounding, just kind of coming to center, and a little bit of community building before we start to engage in a lot of conversations. Our session today isn't going to be very, very interactive, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do want you just to indulge me for one moment. I would like to take you through a grounding and centering exercise. I'll do this together. So, make yourself really comfortable in your seat. Just make yourself really comfortable. Be aware of any tension you might be holding in your body. Be aware of where your feet are. Are they on the ground? Are they crossed? Just settle into your seat. Once you're relaxed, you can take a deep breath. You can choose to close your eyes, or you can stare at a point somewhere right in front of you. And I want you to inhale deep into your belly. And take a couple more long breaths, exhaling slowly, feeling your lungs expanding and contracting. And then slowly just make your breath normal, not forcing it in any way, just letting it be. And as you're breathing and as you're settling, imagine for a moment your favorite place. It could be this campus, sitting under a tree on a bench. It could be anywhere. Just imagine your favorite place. Are you outside? Are you with others? Whatever place you choose, it should be a spot where you can be completely yourself, where you don't need to wear a mask, no pretenses. You are fully yourself. And in this place, what else do you see? Do you see any colors? Do you hear any sounds? Any smells? How does your body feel? Are you warm? Cold? Relaxed? Airy? So step fully into your place, just with ease. And in this place, now I'd like for you to think about or remember a hero or a shiro from your culture, or not, somebody who you admire. Somebody you admire. Imagine you're observing them. What do they look like? How are they walking, or talking, or gesturing, or sitting? And now, as you are watching and observing, I'd like for you to think about, what is it about them that you admire? What qualities or attributes do they have that you admire? Why is this person your hero? Now, I'd like for you to think of a time that you have experienced within yourself an aspect or a quality that they exhibit. Think about a time or an example when that happened. And now, take a moment to thank yourself for the wisdom that you hold. And as we come back to this room and open our eyes, keep with you this feeling that you are valuable to the group because of your wisdom and and what you've learned and your actions is of value to this group and to all groups that you're a member of. Take a couple more breaths. You can give thanks if you'd like, and then slowly open your eyes again. So this exercise, and then what we would normally do in a session is we would share our experiences or what came up for us with our neighbor. We're not going to do that this morning, but this idea is really kind of stemming from this idea of building community, or building community and having knowledge, right? So in our work, we want to start our time together by recognizing that each and every person has knowledge, they have wisdom, they're of value to the group. And so from that place where we're come to the center, right? We come to our center and we share with one another. We start to then have our conversations with one another. And the mentors that I've worked with have encouraged me to always do some sort of grounding and community building before you jump into talking about race. It makes all of the difference. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit of an example of what that is. And specifically because I feel like this experience of returning to center is so germane to the themes that I'd like to continue to explore with you. Something else that's really important in this equity work, and I don't know how many people here have done an equity training or training about culture or led conversations about diversity. Raise your hand, I'm just curious. Oh, beautiful, yeah. And so you guys know about guidelines and the importance of having some norms which involve things like confidentiality and compassionate listening and respect, right? And challenging yourself to share your truth, right? And willingness to make mistakes. You know, these are all things that they look great on paper, awesome, yep, check. But to actually do it and to hold a space where other people are being encouraged to do it is a different ballgame and not always so easy. So coming back to this idea of acting from the center, I'd like to share with you a little bit about this theme that I've been exploring lately in my equity work, and it's a theme related to love and justice. And so probably for the past month and a half, I've been thinking a lot about what to share with you and thinking a lot about the context of this conference. And on the way up, I'm asking Amy all these questions about, and then being here on this campus and just how it feels to be here. Thinking about love and justice together is something that I would like us to consider, especially on this last day as we round out our trainings and then go respectively into our summers and then preparing for the next year. So this philosophy around love and justice is a strategy that grounds a lot of the equity consultation that I do. And really kind of the main thesis is that we should use loving kindness, goodwill, and compassion as a source of our greatest strengths. And I know this from my own experience that love can lay the ground for real dialogue and change. I know this doesn't sound terribly intellectual. I know this sounds like a big departure from my very serious research agenda and the very serious policy consultation I do with the federal government and other state administrators, but this I'm sharing with you what I truly believe, and this is really what grounds my work, even my research. Okay, so what does this mean? Right? Love and justice, goodwill, compassion. I worry a little bit about perpetuating stereotypes about fields that are predominantly female, and I worry, is this approach to equity somehow skirting around dealing with harder, more painful issues? I don't know, maybe. But for now, this approach feels very real, and I'd like to share a little bit more with you about it. So loving kindness is not always the image we have in mind when we hear terms like empowerment and social justice and freedom fire or warrior for justice. And don't get me wrong, there are times and situations where we have to show up, where we have to throw down, and I think that this current political and historical climate is presenting us with such a time. But, and hear me very carefully here, whether we do that from a mind of toxic hatred and resentment, or whether we do that from a mind that recognizes that every human being is someone's child and worthy of love and compassion, it depends on how intentionally we practice this mindful compassion in our work. So I'll share with you a little bit about my story, because I didn't start in this place of coming at it from loving compassion and love and justice together. I've spent most of my life fighting against inequalities. I've marched, I've participated in sit-ins, I've created and performed in dance performances and spoken word performances that embody a lot of these ideas. While I was on faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, I pretty much, the entire time I was there, I lived in the space of being the angry brown woman. I was the only woman of color, the only person of color in our department. And so I mentored a lot of students, also a lot of students of color. I fought on their behalf. I cried on their behalf. I rallied on their behalf. And it was very much this place of anger and pain that was fueling a lot of that activity. So I didn't start at this place of very mindful compassion. No, I was railing a lot. And so my journey, I think, more towards love and this idea of mindfulness came at a crossroads. I was witnessing my mentors and my racial justice colleagues and friends. They were kind of dropping out of the scene of doing this racial equity work. They were getting sick. They were experiencing major health crises. And as women, a lot of times we would talk about the toll that this justice work has on our health. Sometimes we even talked about the toll that it took on our emotional and spiritual and physical health, even our ability to conceive and bear children. We talked a lot about those very real and painful issues. But I remember the moment that something in me shifted about this work. It was after a phone call with one of my mentors, and she shared with me that she was leaving her position at a very well-known racial justice organization, and she was going back to her work as a theatrical artist. And so I got off the phone with her. I'm like, okay, great. And I just sat really still. And I just remember having a conversation with myself and God, my higher power, and I kind of said / prayed. I'm like, okay, if I'm going to keep doing this racial equity work front and center in my life, I've got to figure out where this higher vibration is, because I can't stay in this place where I'm constantly holding it in my belly and feeling that kind of sick feeling, right? Like I need to seek out the higher vibration. And literally, probably just a couple of weeks after really being serious about that, and also getting to a place where I felt more comfortable letting my voice come out and getting the courage to speak my truth, and spending a lot of hours committed to racial equity. It really kind of came to me. I had this life kind of fighting for equity and doing all this research on social justice, and then my life doing yoga and meditation and reflective writing, right? And they seemed very separate. And slowly but surely, I started to ask the question, is there room in my kind of personal life, my personal reflective life, is there room for righteous anger? Because that's what I was feeling in my work. I was feeling angry all the time. But as I was meditating or doing yoga, I'm like, what do I do with that? And it seems like there's got to be a place here in all these contemplative practices. There's got to be room for that. Where is the room for that? And so I started doing more reading and talking to people, and I found that these things actually can come together, and they actually should come together. And so, I think that ultimately loving kindness is about opening ourselves up to others with compassion, with equanimity, and that's a challenging exercise. It sounds great just kind of saying it, but it's actually challenging to practice day to day, right? Because it requires us to push back against our own assumptions. It requires us to be aware of our prejudice. It requires us to confront and question the labels that most of us have internalized about ourselves and about others. And that is hard work. That is developing a muscle, right? And so I kind of over time took that anger and turned it not inward, but used that anger in my reflective practices to start to ask these questions and to start to seek some answers. So, at the core of it, I think that for inner transformation, there has to be a level of mindfulness. And not just like while you're meditating or doing yoga or going for your morning walk, but mindfulness as we're going about our day, as we're interacting with other teachers, with children, with families, right? So many of you are already familiar with this quote, be the change you want to see in the world, right? Be the change, right? Talking about inner transformation leading to collective change. Right, now I'm going to share with you my next kind of person that I discovered this past year. This newest inspirational quote comes from a Zen Buddhist priest. Her name is Angel Kyoto Williams. And she says, without inner change, there can be no outer change. And without collective change, no change matters. So she's speaking to two audiences. She's speaking to her social justice friends who are rallying and spending a lot of energy doing this. And she's saying, we got to come back here. And then she's speaking to her like her Buddhist monk friends, you know, her Zen friends who are like this. And she's like, you got to be out here. And like, got to look out here. You've got to bear witness to the suffering that's happening, right? So she's kind of speaking to both of those audiences. And so, you know, there's that constant tension. How do we reconcile that tension? Is there room in our kind of meditative or contemplative or inner life frameworks for this anger? And where do we go from there? So, okay. So what I've shared with you so far are these ideas that seem very abstract and spiritual and touchy-feely, a little bit of woohoo maybe. But how do these ideas translate to the work and the context that many of us operate in every day? So many of us, including me, we're in these academic and scientific and serious work environments where people might not listen to approaches that seem very, you know, like bumper sticker slogans, right? So how do we talk about this work in ways that people will say, oh, yes, I think we can put some funding and invest some money behind that approach. So let's get real. Let's talk about the real world for a second. Have you guys heard about the school to prison pipeline? You guys talking about that? Well, in my work, I'm sure in your work as well, we talk about the preschool to prison pipeline, or the cradle to prison. Yeah, we recognize that a lot of these predictors are starting very, very early in life. You know, there are a lot of statistics about this, and you know, now we are able to, you know, look at children as young as 2 and 3, and with certain, you know, behaviors and certain patterns that are happening. I mean, preschool expulsion is a really big indicator of where a child might be headed. And unfortunately, we do know that preschool expulsions do predict outcomes that lead to being involved with the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system. So it's something that we're starting to take really seriously in this country. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with some of these statistics. Walter Gilliam, in a study conducted in 2004, you know, did a national study with public pre-K and found that boys of color are 6 to 8 times more likely to be expelled from preschool, and he broke it down by other ethnicities as well. African American girls also, I think, 12 times more likely to be expelled than their white female peers. And it's not just expulsions. You know, we're finding a lot of disparities for other disciplinary actions, and maybe some of you are even seeing it in your own classrooms, in your own schools where you work. There's a huge disproportionality with what's happening with discipline. And what we're finding in the research is it's disproportionate discipline for similar actions as their white peers. So we're noticing some trends here. And unfortunately, there are differences by race and gender. So we know that boys of color are more likely to be expelled from preschool. So, you know, we have these racial disparities. And so people were asking, okay, what's behind those numbers? Why is this happening, right? And so during the Obama administration, he developed an initiative called My Brother's Keeper. And I don't know if you guys remember My Brother's Keeper. It was an initiative focused on issues related to boys and men of color. Well, they had an early childhood component. They had a woman, Chantal Meek, who was working on the early childhood component, and she was really interested in taking on this idea of preschool expulsions and disproportionate discipline. And so she spent a lot of time talking to people around the country about, you know, what's behind these numbers. And implicit bias is kind of the big thing that came up and we were all talking about. Other findings from research are lower expectations of children. This is also one of the reasons. This perception of threat, right? Like seeing boys of color in particular as less innocent and older than they are, right? And able to cause bodily harm. This perception of threat, yes, even in 3, 4, and 5-year-old children was very real for teachers. And then with some of our African American teachers, when we ask them about discipline, there's this idea of, look, you know, these children are getting ready to go out into a world where they will not be understood, where they're going to be judged differently. I have to be really harsh with them now to protect them, and so they're ready for the real world. So these kind of, you know, misguided intentions, I think, coming from a good place, but misguided about protecting children and preparing them for the hot stove of racism that was out there in the real world. These are some of the reasons that we were seeing these differences in discipline. So, early childhood mental health consultation. Are you guys familiar with this? I know you've got a program here in Minnesota. It's funded by HHS. This was an approach that was called out by Walter Gilliam's early work in 2004. He found that in centers where they had an early childhood mental health consultant present, that those disparities, those same racial disparities, weren't seen at the same rates. And so this started to become a very kind of promising way of addressing preschool expulsions. But what happened was that the other story about race and gender kind of fell off. So a lot of energy, a lot of funding, a lot of initiatives happened supporting early childhood mental health consultation, but we weren't talking about race. We were talking about other things. So in Arizona, we have a program called Smart Support, which is mental health consultation, and we got into the game too. And I'd like to share with you a story of something that we saw in Smart Support, and I'll talk to you a little bit about our data. So let's make this idea a little bit more concrete and talk about mental health consultation. And I think this example is going to feel very familiar to many of you because of the work that you do. But so imagine there's a 4-year-old African-American boy in preschool. There are some issues, there are challenges. The teacher is having a really hard time, and when the mental health consultant goes in to talk with his teacher about this situation, she describes him as being aggressive and cruel and uses words like manipulative and self-destructive and volatile. When she describes her relationship with him or her perception, she's saying, this child's behaviors, they interfere with my ability to be an effective teacher. Right? They're not likely to improve significantly. And there are days that I just hope this child is going to be absent because I know that my day is going to be easier. So they've got a conflictual relationship, right? She kind of demonstrates or says that this child has low initiative. He struggles with controlling his behavior. These are some of the issues that we talk about. And this is kind of a very common scenario that a lot of consultants are dealing with when they go into classrooms. So the mental health consultant comes in and does things like, asks for like coherent narratives of experience and uses parallel process and, talks about secure-based relationships. And her work is based on attachment theory. And she uses something called the consultative stance, which involves a therapeutic presence and developmentally appropriate choices and emotional availability. And I'm intentionally sharing a lot of the mental health terminology that we use, but these terminology that get people to take our work very seriously, right? Therapeutic presence, that sounds really good. Consultative stance sounds really good. Like we need these constructs, So we go back 6 months later and talk to the teacher, and now the teacher is describing this boy as hopeful and steady, excited and playful. They've got a stronger attachment. She says that he's able to regulate his behavior better. She reports that he's taking more initiative. She describes the relationship as being closer. She's not sending the child to the director's office as often, right? And she doesn't believe anymore that this child is interfering with her ability to be a strong teacher. Whoa, hopeful, incredible. What a story. This is amazing, right? The truth is that this pattern, this amazing transformation, we saw this happen for over 1,000 children in Arizona. We saw this same kind of transformation again and again and again. This pattern of positive change was true for all children. We found statistically significant results for a whole sample, but when we pulled out Black and Latino boys, we saw the strongest increases for African American and Latino children, especially the boys. Those same children who are at risk for being funneled into this preschool to prison pipeline. We saw incredible growth for these same children. I don't know how well you can read that. But what improved over 12 months? We started with a gap. African American and Latino boys were scored well below their white peers. And over 12 months, the gap was closed. The rate of improvement was so steep, was so high. for Black and Latino children, especially boys. So for African American children, where we saw the biggest increases were in attachment, self-regulation, teacher-child conflict. I want to point out that these are all teacher-reported measures that we used. So these are teacher-reported. For Latino boys, we saw improvements in attachment, initiative, self-regulation, teacher-child closeness, risk of expulsion. All right, so these are teacher-reported measures. The gaps were closed after 12 months. I saw these results, and I went back to the consultants, and I said, well, you guys got to help me understand this particular pattern and what happened with boys of color. Were you guys talking about race and bias? No, we were not. So what happened? So we've spent really, like literally the past 2 years still unpacking these findings. You know, the racial gap was closed. You know, they didn't go in talking about social justice, the consultants, right? What shifted? You know, when we talk to the mental health consultants, they say, well, curiosity about the meaning of behavior, that's what shifted. They say our relationships, we had supportive relationships with these teachers. And through the parallel process, then those teachers are able to develop supportive relationships with children and families. They said compassion happened. They said empathy happened. They said trust happened. And again, I want to remind you guys probably know this already, but this intervention, early childhood mental health consultation, this is not a child-focused intervention where the consultant goes in and kind of fixes these broken children. This is an adult-level intervention. It's something that Walter Gilliam reminds us about all the time. This is an adult-level intervention. So what shifted for the adults? How do we explain this pattern? So I, for the purposes of today and really kind of keeping it a little bit, shorter narrative in my mind, I like to boil it down to kind of two big terms that encompass a lot of what happens in mental health consultation. It's mindfulness, right? This is like all the internal stuff that goes on. And with the help of a consultant, teachers are encouraged to reflect, and talk about their stories and right? And then this leaning in, this interpersonal work, the relationship that happens. Building a relationship, communicating with the family, understanding the context, right? This leaning in. When things get difficult and others are like, whoa, they were like, yeah, tell me more about that. Let's talk about that. We can deal with this. So we've talked about mindfulness in the internal. We've talked about interpersonal relationships. I'd like to broaden our lens and think a little bit about the institutional or the structural or the systemic. So let's consider that in terms of equity. What is equity? How do we understand it? I like this framework from World Trust. And trust me, I love frameworks. The more arrows and the more complicated, the better. But I like this one. It's simple. But it also kind of encompasses like this idea that the external and the internal are influencing. It's got this infinity symbol, and it's happening again and again and again simultaneously. This is not a linear process. And framing race in this way, it gives people an access to a lens. It allows you to see the bigger picture. And at the same time, it develops common understanding, some common language, so that we can explore equity using the same terms. And this is critical for supporting our analysis. And our analysis where we can ask questions like, okay, what is really happening here and why? So when we think about preschool expulsions, when we think about discipline disparities, when we think about what's happening with children of color in our classrooms, what is happening here and why? Right? It reminds us to not just look at this use this deficit view of just like looking at the child, but it reminds us that there's a whole story here. There's a whole broader context. And it helps us remember that systems of inequity, they're not caused by bad people or bad actors. Instead, this is like a self-perpetuating system. We can certainly intervene, right? We can certainly intervene. But there are forces much bigger than what we normally see on a day-to-day level. It's important for us to acknowledge and remember, we were born into a system that we did not create. However, we are all accountable for changing it. And this is empowering, right? Because it shifts the energy from one of guilt to one of action, right? And so that's something that's really key to remember. We might not have created it, but we are all responsible for shifting it, right? So what I'd like to share with you now is a video. I don't know if anybody's seen this before. It's only about 5 minutes, but I love this video. It's a really beautiful metaphor for how we can think about equity and how we can think more broadly about children's development. And while you watch this, I'd like for you to just kind of pay attention to what resonates with you while you watch it. Is there something that you see that maybe you don't agree with? But just kind of pay attention to yourself and your experience watching this video. Oh. Sorry guys, I'm just trying to make it bigger. All right. Okay, that'll work. All right. All right, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I think we got it.
This story is about a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. And she takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and what she notices is that every single one of the red seeds has sprouted. And some of the seed is tall, some of the red flowers are tall and strong and flourishing. The weak seed in the red at least has sprouted and made it to a middling height. But when she looks in the pink box, in that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And the strong pink seed is just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens. Until finally, 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. Now we'll interrupt that to say that this first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the flower boxes, the contemporary structural factors, keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in this garden? Well, that's when the gardener's looking at her flowers and she says, those pink flowers are so scraggly and scrawny, and she plucks those blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, and she plucks it out before it can establish itself. And then where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, you have the pink flowers in their box trying to make it, looking over at red, which is all flourishing and flaunted. And here come the bees. And the bees are minding their own business. They're just collecting nectar, but they're pollinating at the same time. So the bees are buzzing around. Here come the bees to the pink flowers. Bzz, bzz, and it comes over to this one pink flower. Bzz, and the pink flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red." Because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So then the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, you could say, well, let's address the internalized racism. So we're going to go over to the pink flowers and we're going to say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, which might make the pink flowers feel better, but that in and of itself is not going to change the conditions in which they live. Or you could say, okay, well, I understand that. Let's address the personally mediated racism. So let's go talk to the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is all good. But we're going to say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink blossoms? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. What you really need to do if you want to set things right in this garden is to address the institutionalized racism. So you have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's okay too, although to me it makes it easier to segregate resources. But if you want to keep separate boxes, then you have to enrich that poor, rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich, fertile soil. And when you do that, you know the pink flowers will flourish. They will look grand and beautiful and wonderful. Maybe even better than the red, because they have, after all, been selected for survival and strength, which is a very, very interesting notion. And then once those pink flowers are flourishing, they'll no longer be looking over at red, wanting to be red. So you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. And in addressing the institutionalized racism, you may even address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink. But her children, seeing the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to adopt that attitude. So this story has very quickly been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. We can address the other levels at the same time, but we have to at least address the institutionalized racism, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. There's just one last piece to the story, which is the important question: who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I've given the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources. And who is this gardener really? Well, certainly government is part of the gardener. You know, sometimes I joke and say, well, maybe the rich people behind government are part of the gardener. Maybe we can be our own gardener in communities if we have this power to decide, power to act, and control of resources, which is what I also describe as self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, whoever's going to have this power, it's very important that the gardener be concerned with equity. If the gardener is not concerned with equity, then you'll have the scrawny-looking pink flowers and the pretty red flowers, and the gardener will be thinking that the garden is beautiful, when in fact it is not.
So I love that question that she poses at the end, which is, who is the gardener? And so for the purposes of today, I would like to think about ourselves as being the gardener, right? And the role that we play in holding each other in mind and examining institutions, and where are we putting resources, who are we talking with. And so, you know, this idea of a system, because we've got the external, we've got the systemic, but then we also have the internal. And so I'm thinking about how they influence one another. And in this case, in this example, in this example, the system in Arizona is known as First Things First. It's where the funding stream came from. And they funded mental health consultation very well, had plenty of money for professional development, adequately staffed and decent caseloads, so consultants have plenty of time for reflection and ongoing reflective supervision once a week. So the system, in our case, provided enough resources for mental health consultants to do this important work. Now, how is the system influenced by this work that was happening in Smart Support? One thing that we did was we did have enough money to do an evaluation. We did that data analysis. We disaggregated by race and by gender, and we shared that data we shared that data far and wide, especially with our state funder and with system administrators and with regional councils who are also responsible for making funding decisions. And these results, in turn, inspired more funding. And now we even have more resources and more of a call to address things like race and culture and equity and taking a look at discipline disparities. So I think this is a nice example of how, we can see the system influencing our interpersonal and individual responses, and how those interpersonal and individual responses in turn continue to influence the system. And so those are the things that I'd really like for you to also keep in mind as you finish your time here with each other today, is how are my internal resources and processes, how are they influencing my decision making? How are they influencing the way I see families and children? We always return to center again and again and again. And so to end our time together, I'd like to share just a little bit about my background and what I bring, kind of as a way to inspire you to think about who you're bringing with you into the room. So my father, on my father's side, my great-great-grandparents were slaves, and my father grew up black and poor during Jim Crow. When he was 15 years old, he and his brother caught a bus to Phoenix one summer, and they picked cotton that whole summer for 5 cents a row, and the rows extended like from here to the back of the room. They saved their money, and they sent money back home to their mom so she could buy a bus ticket to join them in Phoenix, and that's where they spent the rest of their adolescence and early adulthood. And then my mother's family, they're originally from Czechoslovakia, and she was a young child during the time of Hitler's reign, and they managed to hide their Jewish lineage. They were exiled from Czechoslovakia. They were refugees in Germany during World War II. She was about 7 years old when that happened, and they had to rely on the kindness of strangers and farmers to take them in and offer them shelter and food. So that's a little bit about their background. They met in Germany in the 60s, and they moved to America in the 70s. When I was 2 years old, I was born in Germany. And their union and their relationship happened in the wake of the Loving case, the historical Loving case, where in 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was finally legal for a black person to be married to a white person. So I was born 3 years after that Supreme Court case in 1970, and I'm proud to be part of the Loving generation. And I am very happy and honored right now to be here in front of you talking about love in regards to social justice. And, I constantly reflect on my history, my family, their journey to help me understand who I am today and why I do what I do. My mother and father came from two different worlds, but they had some really essential experiences in common. They both consciously moved away from home to experience the bigger world. They both traveled to other countries and learned new languages. They were both confronted with prejudice and hatred, but they also made a lot of cross-cultural friendships. They were both idealists, they were optimists, they were dreamers, they were lovers of life. And of course, over the years, they've slowed down, but they are still the brightest light in any room. And, they're not perfect, right? Far from it. But I have to believe that the best parts of them are in me. And this is what I have to share with the world. And that is what I use every day to heal my own suffering and to help others heal too. And so my question is, who do you bring with you when you walk into a room or walk into a classroom? And so my challenge for you the rest of the day is, as you travel from this session to the next and you continue your work with other dynamic trainers that are here and you deepen your commitment to collective action and to fighting the good fight, I'm going to really challenge you to be aware of what's happening inside of you. So when you walk into your next room, get your things settled, get comfortable in your chair, take a deep breath, and just remember to be present. Take the briefest of moments to connect with what else and who else is in the room with you, right? So I'm referring to your own history, your own beliefs, your experiences, your relationships, and from that place, then enter into your conversations in your final sessions. So, be aware of your body as you're talking and as you're sharing your truth with each others. Practice deep listening. Our healing, our path to solutions, it's not going to come from intellectualized learning, right? Where only our heads and our brains are processing information. True healing and true liberation will come from a more embodied experience. So remember to be in your body. And so as we come to the end of our time together, and even though we didn't have a lot of dialogue with one another, I think we still collectively experienced something profound by simply being here in the same room with similar intentions and considering the power of love and justice. So let's have a little bit of closure before we move on. I usually like to end my sessions with something called reading ourselves whole. So this idea, this terminology is borrowed from another equity leader. Her name is Dr. Rhonda McGee. And it's just a simple exercise that kind of helps our group experiencing the oneness of the whole. So, I don't know, can you guys read these words? So let's read this all together, okay? In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All of us are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. So thank you all very much. I've enjoyed my time here with you today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.